Hello, it's Mrs. Wallace. How you doing? I said I would do this video for you, so here it is. I hope that it's enough. If you find that some of it's repetitive because you remember it from class, just skip over what you remember. I tried to do at least Monday and Tuesday's class, and we kind of bounced around a little bit. Some of the slides that we looked at, and I'll try to note anything that's a handout so that way, you can either pick up the handout or make sure that I attach it for you. We went back to Burckhardt's argument, so we just noted some of the key parts of Burckhardt's argument. And, it's useful to just note that there are a large group of people who are historians who support some degree of Burckhardt's argument. His argument is old, kind of outdated. It's from 1860. But this idea that the Renaissance is something that is distinctly, innovative or something significant, maybe in specific ways like art, for example, or culture. Those are arguments that other historians make, even in contemporary times. But there are historians who question that for a variety of reasons. The Renaissance was a period that was distinct from the Middle Ages. That's something that Burckhardt argues. Middle Ages was not really modern. It's under a veil. It kind of has maybe faith as its primary authority. He argues the Renaissance was different, innovative, and maybe, we can imply questioning the exclusive role of the church as a source of knowledge. He talks about Dante as a leading figure, who is probably more of a Middle Ages figure, but somebody who is in this time period of like the late 1200s. He does argue that the Renaissance really starts in Italy, where there's a great deal of emphasis. And, Burckhardt's interest was largely in the Italian Renaissance. He notes Florence in particular as a city-state where there is specific nurturing of artistic talent, and he attributes some of this to wealth. He attributes some of this to competition between city-states and a variety of other reasons. But he uses some language, individualism or individual shapes and personalities occur rather than group identities. And, he goes on to talk about individual genius and some of that. We did talk a little bit about what led to the rebirth, and these are arguments that you might be able to use to either support Burckhardt or to criticize Burckhardt. So we spent some time in class trying to think through how you might critique Burckhardt, so I'll try to note that a little bit. One thing that a lot of historians note is that throughout Europe, there's a great deal of increase in trade. Some of this might be connected to Silk Road, the Mongols, so Pax Mongolica, according to some historians, really benefits Europe because they're the ones that kind of receive a large degree of goods that they hadn't before. So they are in a new space to be recipients of some of these really significant, goods from, the from Asia and whatnot. You also have the Crusades. So there are Europeans, for example, who will go and create crusader states, in some of the areas of like modern day Jerusalem. And even though those creator states, don't last, some of them will come back with new ideas. So historians have kind of pitched that there's a great deal of trade that's increasing for Europe, and that's something distinct. So maybe that is a reason why we see kind of a movement into something different. New ideas infused into the society kind of makes sense. I think a lot of historians, and this is where you can probably look at an argument that refutes Burckhardt. There are some historians who argue that the Islamic Golden Age, which starts much earlier, earlier arguably than the year 1000, but continues, largely into the time period of the European Renaissance, even into the Mongol period where you have some Islamic scholars that are still consistently, kind of following some of the ideas of the Islamic Golden Age. So we can make a case that, there's a lot of influence from the Islamic Golden Age on Europe. And one example of that would be the, texts that get translated into Arabic and then ultimately largely through Spain and maybe partially Venice. We get a lot of translation into into Latin. And so there is this huge infusion of texts that really gives Europeans a great deal of ideas, because a lot of the texts include not only the works of classical thinkers, like Aristotle, for example, but they also include commentaries by some of the Islamic scholars. Ibn Rushd is a really good example. So, that's kind of one way to look at the influence. There are some historians who are contemporary historians who make the case that the European Renaissance and the Islamic Golden Age are essentially the same thing, that they're connected to the same set of texts, and that these texts are kind of, texts that initially get looked at by Islamic scholars and then find their way. There are some texts that will also get in from Byzantine. Constantinople falls to the Ottoman Empire in the middle of the 1400s, and so a lot of Byzantine Greeks will relocate to cities in Italy like Ravenna, and so we see a lot of Byzantine influences and Greek influences. So, Italy becomes this place of maybe a space where there's some increase in texts and maybe increase in Greek-speaking influences and whatnot, and maybe that has an influence. If you really wanted to challenge Burckhardt's argument, you could really suggest, these, notions of a European Renaissance are not necessarily so new. There's something that is really an extension of something that was happening elsewhere in the world. Burckhardt really relies on the notion that the plague is uniquely something that happens in Europe in such a challenging way that you have a rebirth after the plague. And this maybe connects to some of the things that we talked about in class with Petrarch, and maybe the Decameron, which is written by Boccaccio, that really highlights the experience that Europeans, maybe particularly in the city of Florence, where 60% of the population ends up, succumbing to the plague. So the plague is a really significant thing. We talked about the plague doctor. There are physicians in the time period. These may be people who did get educated in some aspect of anatomy. There were also a lot of people who called themselves physicians who were not legitimate physicians, and medical knowledge at this point is fairly limited. There's no germ theory, for example. A lot of the kind of sophisticated anatomy information that the Islamic Empire had starts to come across. And one of the things that affects is the aspect of like sanitation. Even though there's no knowledge of germ theory, it's pretty clear at the plague that this is a contagious disease, that people need to stay away from other people. It travels in a variety of ways. Some people would get the plague in their bloodstream. Some people would breathe it in. So there's like different forms of plague, and it's likely the plague that was swinging around may have had some common, aspects to it, but it probably also was different strains, of the plague, something that we could kind of relate to after COVID, how, a particular, disease could converge into something else, and then all of a sudden you're looking for this, type of disease versus this type of disease or whatever. But the plague doctor has kind of like the mask of the Renaissance era, which is like a beak of sorts, which would be filled with like potpourri. The belief was that if you could get rid of the bad air, that you wouldn't be exposed to the plague, disease. So a big part of this is, kind of the way in which people think the plague is happening. But after the plague, European doctors and hospitals will get much more sophisticated because there's a huge interest in making the entire system better. And some of it will be modeled on, the likes of the Islamic Empire or Byzantine. So it is kind of interesting. The plague definitely has some, it moves the dial in Europe in terms of medical knowledge. This just gives us a sense of how widespread the plague is. You can see the very dark red where the plague is very consistent. It's believed that it probably comes comes from Asia. It's probably the same strain that affects the end of the Mongols, for example, as affects Europe. But in any case, we get a really extensive, this is not unique to Florence, so lots of places succumb to the plague. If it is a cause of the Renaissance, it doesn't necessarily give us all of the answers. Burckhardt's argument would kind of suggest the following. Why Italy? What makes Italy so special? These manuscripts that you have. Also, the advent of the printing press, which comes from Germany. It's, something that's developed in Asia much earlier, but comes to Europe through Germany. And it's really kind of late to get to Florence, actually. But once it does, there is some use of it. So we do get manuscripts, and the degree of text increasing is very significant in the time of the Renaissance. So some of the latter Renaissance thinkers, have their works distributed widely, as does the church. There is a merchant and a noble class that have a great deal of economic and political power. So there is definitely a social hierarchy. Within Italy, you have city-states that have different types of government. There might be an outsider who kind of rules, signori. You might have oligarchs like the Medici family that have a great deal of economic power in the society. These are Italian city-states that tend to be wealthy. We don't see a unified Italy at this time, so there's no political central, kind of space for a state. You do have the Vatican and the Papal States as something religiously significant. They also have a military and land and, all kinds of economic activities, but you don't really have a unified Italy. You largely have competing Italian city-states. So Milan might compete with Florence, and Florence might end up using art as a way to compete with Milan. So some of that is maybe partially what's going on. There's also the post-plague economic advantages. So despite the fact that during the plague, there's these horrific productivity problems. People leave their fields, fallow, so that they can escape the horrors of the plague. And while that's going on, there's not a lot of productivity. But at the same time, 50 years later, when the population is smaller and there's a lot more resources and a lot fewer workers, wages will increase. And we see some development of a larger middle class as a result of the plague. It kind of resets, in a way, some of the access to resources. This just gives us a map so you can see where Florence is. So we've been talking about Florence a lot. Sorry. It is a space that is both, a city-state and a city. So you have the Republic of Florence, and, this is kind of the city of Florence. But, kind of look at something like that. And then you have Milan, you have Venice, you have Savoy, you have a variety of other city-states, Naples in the south. Oh, we have a fire drill. I am going to have to go.